Terry O'Reilly is an award-winning advertising and marketing practitioner. He's well known across Canada. And of course, you'll recognize him for his wonderful CBC radio series, Under the Influence. You may remember the program prior to that was called The Age of Persuasion. Terry is one of the most insightful, creative people in the country. We really appreciate Terry taking a few minutes to be with us today. Terry, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Terry, over the years, safe to say you've been one of the most important creative voices for radio over many, many years. February 13th is World Radio Day, and UNESCO believes that radio has an important part to play on the issue of climate change. And I wonder if, from your perspective, you think radio has the power to change awareness and behavior for something that's important?
Boy, that's a big question. Well, the great thing about radio is how far and wide it reaches. That's really especially in this country, because we're all geography and no history in this country. So radio can really reach coast to coast and north. As far as climate change goes, Mike, I think that's such a difficult subject. I've talked to David Suzuki about it often. He calls climate change a slow motion disaster, because you look out your window and you see green trees and birds and you think, oh, it's, everything's good, but it's not. And I remember he once said to me, he thought he's been a 25-year failure. And I said, how can you say that, David? And he said, because nobody's listening to me. So could radio help spread good practices or get people motivated? It is possible because of the reach of radio, but it's a really difficult subject.
And certainly CBC and community radio stations across the country play a big part in this, being able to reach the population. You must feel strongly about the importance of local radio and national radio.
Yeah, I do feel strongly about that, especially local, because I think it, for all the obvious reasons, it gives you news that's immediately important to you, not beyond just weather and things of that nature, but I think it reflects the community. There's a lot of community outreach. It's a community building, community exercise radio, really. It's where everybody comes together. You hear local voices, you hear advertising for local businesses. And I've always thought that local radio will probably never go, because it's so important.
I know that you've been in love with the medium for many years. What is it about radio that energizes you?
Well, it's funny, Mike, I got into radio in a serendipitous way. I had no intention of getting into radio. So when I got out of Ryerson in 1981, I wanted to get into advertising agencies to be a writer. And it was a recession, a mild one, but nobody was hiring. And the only job I could get was at an FM 108 radio station in Burlington. This little private radio station hired me to be the writer. It's the only job I could find. I really wasn't interested in doing just radio. But while I was there, don't I fall in love with the medium? I mean, that job really changed the whole trajectory of my career eventually, because I'm still in radio, 40 plus years later. What I discovered at FM 108, because I was all alone, so I got to make all the mistakes that one makes when you're learning a medium. And I didn't have to answer to anybody, Mike. I was really the lone writer and pseudo creative director of this little radio station, but I got to experiment. And I learned very early that, the cliche of radio is that's theater of the mind, but it is a truism, because I realized I could be in a heart valve in a radio spot, or at the bottom of the ocean, or on the moon, or in a rocket ship. And all I had to do was write it well and use a bag of sound effects, and listeners would be there with me. And you couldn't pull that off on television. You would never have the budget to really pull that off on television. So, and the other thing I love about radio, Mike, is that people will picture the best of everything to them. When I did my radio seminars every year, which I did in Toronto for probably 15 years, I would hold a big radio day at a theater in Toronto, and I'd invite all these young copywriters, but be about 200 people in the audience. And I'd get up on that stage, Mike, for 7 hours. and teach them everything I had learned about radio. So, 30 seconds versus 60 seconds, studio protocol, humor versus drama, how to use sound effects, how to brief a music writer, how to present radio. These were everything I was imparting to them. But I would do this little exercise where I would say, okay, picture the following moment in your mind. You're in a beautiful meadow. It's a sunny day. You see a horse galloping towards you with a rider. The horse jumps over a brook, passes by you, passes by his beautiful old barn, and then disappears into the horizon. Then I would say, okay, now hands up if it was a white horse, brown horse, black horse, male rider, female rider, red barn, gray barn. And the hands would just be going like this because everybody was picturing the best of that scenario to them. And I think that's the power of radio. TV makes you accept a single image, and radio is Technicolor, personally Technicolor.
I used to say that when I was on radio, I was always 1 foot taller than I actually am.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
It was very helpful. Now, finally, I'd like to focus on radio today because we have such a multimedia climate out there. There's so much available. What is radio's importance today against all those options that exist out there?
That's a very good question because it's getting tougher and tougher for traditional mediums to exist alongside social and digital platforms. The thing that I love about radio, beyond reach and everything we just discussed, is that there is a continuity and it's the sound of the human voice, I think. And I know you can argue that you can hear that on videos, on YouTube, etc., but there's something about a live human voice, not a pre-recorded one. There's something about an affinity you have for radio hosts. If a morning show team changes, you feel like your whole world's turned upside down because they're such a part of your routine. Even I find on our show on CBC, people our biggest fans are so attuned to every little thing. Like the emails we get, they'll reference something 4 years ago in an episode, and I'm always so absolutely amazed at how tightly they stick to our show. And Bruce Springsteen once said that his career it's an ongoing conversation with his fans, his records. And he said, you have to keep track of that conversation. And I thought that was very insightful. And I feel that way about our show, that I really have to keep track of the conversation. And even if I'm mentioning something I mentioned 4 years ago, is to say to the listeners, as I mentioned in a previous episode, because I know they know that. I don't want them to think, what, Terry's mentioned this before. Doesn't he remember? I know they're with me. So that kind of engagement is astounding to me on radio.
Interesting thing too, Under the Influence, which is on CBC across Canada, but it's also available online. People can listen to it at their leisure in their car. One must really help complement the other.
I often wonder if they're two different audiences, and I suspect they are. I think people who love listening to CBC radio is one audience, and then our podcast audience is a different audience. So it's an audience that trends a little younger. Podcasting, is really a medium that I'm finding that is more probably in the 20, 30, and 40-year-old range than it is in the 50 plus. There's exceptions to every rule, but just judging by the feedback we get. But it's an interesting thing. I think podcasting has really extended the lifespan of radio too, in a way. It's become an audio-centric world in a way. I remember when the internet first appeared, my production company, Pirate Radio and Television, we almost couldn't find any work on internet, online. Nobody wanted sound. The first thing you would do when you landed on a website would be to shut down the sound. Everybody was just reaching for the off button on audio. And I thought, it's a strange thing that audio hasn't come along with the online world. And then podcasting changed all that. Yeah. That really, we only exist as a podcast online, and it's all audio. Even YouTube becoming the biggest listening platform for podcasts. And I find that stunning that you would think that wouldn't be the biggest platform. It is the world's biggest platform for podcast listening.
Wow. I didn't realize that. And it is, when you think about it, an amazing point. And it shows that the media, each medium has an opportunity to evolve and be a part of this overall landscape. And radio certainly has a part to play in being a part of not only what's on the air, but on their independent websites, on any podcasting they might do independently as well. So I guess one could say that radio looks pretty good for the future.
I think so. Because it delivers so many things that other mediums do not. And it doesn't have, I'll say one more thing, Mike, it doesn't have that social media hate factor, because it's as you know only too well if you spend any time on X or Twitter. I mean, there's a lot of trolling, and radio is kind of an oasis in that world.
It is indeed.
Yeah.
Terry, thank you for joining us today, helping us not only recognize but celebrate World Radio Day. It's coming up on the 13th of the month, and thanks for spending time with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Terry O'Reilly has been our guest. He's host of CBC's Under the Influence and an award-winning creative leader in the advertising and marketing field.